Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of StreamTime Sports. My name is Chris Stone, the community lead, joined as always by our CEO, Nick Meacham. Now, Nick, I know you've been doing a little bit of traveling, but have you had a chance to watch any of the basketball? You know, the other week we spoke about the WNBA with Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese and boosting TV ratings. I don't know if you saw the flagrant foul that got everybody all upset. I don't know if you've been watching the Western Conference playoffs. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander getting everybody's head, baiting for foul calls. And, in the UK, there's just popular saying, woke nonsense, thinking about modern day football and soccer. And I don't know, Nick, do you have a take on some of this? Because, I thought there was a pretty weak flagrant foul that they gave Caitlin Clark. Some of the, Shai Gilgeous stuff of him flopping around the court. It's not the basketball I grew up with, Nick.
No, the good old days of the authentic, what sport's supposed to be like. Look, I think what's interesting is it just shows the power of social media, right? With one little thing can manifest in such a big story. I have seen so many replays of that clip through my social channels, and it overtook where the NBA's coverage was really from in through my channels anyway, which is insane for what it was. And part of it really grinds my gears. But for me, from my business hat, there's a real learning on these little storytelling moments that can be turned into something such significant that it can drive such huge, insane audience engagement. But yeah, that was a bit overkill. What I have been seeing a lot of lately is I haven't had a chance to watch much because I have been traveling quite a bit. But also the time zone, obviously, is not what it was for me 12 months ago when I was on Eastern time hours. I have been seeing a lot of great snapshots and highlights of the night before and seeing the examples of what Indiana did to New York and the like. And I just have found it interesting to see how many times I keep getting served same variations of the same things. And that's an interesting just learning I'm taking from looking at what content I'm consuming through a slightly different lens to go, oh gosh, can you just stop serving me the same set of highlights? And maybe it's my fault. Maybe it's because I'm watching them too long and they keep serving it to me because I keep showing that I want more of it, but it's getting a bit repetitious. I'd like to see a bit more of what's going on just than the same clips that go viral all the time. But no, it's exciting when you see the parity that still exists in the NFL and the NBA and how successful those leagues are in terms of audience engagement. Then you compare that to what happens in European football leagues, and there is a little bit of that, but there's a lot of, in the leagues themselves, the same top five teams leading the way. Maybe a random one pops up year on year, but that jeopardy is not the same in Europe as it is in the US, and I think that's really exciting.
Well, I do find it interesting. I worked at an agency for about 18 months out of university before Sports Pro, and used to always get the brief from the client, be like, help us create a viral moment. It's like, this doesn't really happen, right? Like going viral, I think it's tough to just plan, as you say, this was just a kind of a hard foul, and next thing you know, it's got however many millions and millions of views. But one of the things you talk about there, Nick, that I think is interesting in sports is what the power of a rivalry can do. You think Tiger versus Phil back in the day, Michael versus the Bad Boy Pistons. He had his things with Reggie Miller. I know we want to talk about these inclusive, sports environments and positivity. There is something to be said about having two sets of people that don't like each other. I don't think there's an issue with that.
Well, you think about every major movie and every TV show that's basically filmed, there's always a good guy and a bad guy involved. And I think you need that. I think what makes sports successful is the storytelling bit, the narrative bit. You can have sports where there's a dominant player. And if they're too dominant, then the sport loses its charm. But if there's that rivalry that's just needs to be strong enough where a star can shine, but there's enough competition there, so there's a bit of jeopardy. There's a fine balancing act. I'm thinking like F1 versus golf. Your Tiger Woods versus say maybe Verstappen in the last couple of years, or Schumacher in the generation beforehand. It can really go off a cliff edge if there is no competition, relatively speaking, happening in that time. I remember seeing odds for, going back into the betting conversation briefly, that odds for Tiger to win a tournament, he was odds-on favorite to win, which means he is basically, it's him. He's more likely to win than out of every single person in the entire field. He's more likely to win than any other of the 70 that he's playing against. That sort of odds is incredible, but that's the dominance. But then you couple that there was still enough rivalry, enough competition between people like Phil to make it interesting, and the personalities and characters behind it really helped that as well. So sport has taken a little bit of that character out of it when they've had to be really careful about how they speak in public, and a lot of media training over the years. But sometimes I think social media is given a little bit back on that front as well for some, particularly for some athletes who now have platforms that they can speak their mind and have their own way to market, which maybe hopefully is a sign of things to come.
Hopefully, like I said, I know people will hate on a Roy Keane or someone like that, but we need more people. Just speak your mind a little bit.
I just have to say though, like a Roy Keane, for someone like a Roy Keane to get a job in the first place is, and to be successful at getting, I guess, driving interest in the virality of some of the comments he makes and be able to keep that going. And for someone like Sky, who's a big major broadcaster, to continue to back it and to get so much value out of that. Great foresight by the people who are coming up with the types of hosts you need this day and age. Like, I still don't get it. I still don't get how in the NBA, inside the NBA, a Shaq and Charles Barkley and Kenny Smith, what's their host's name?
Brewer?
Eric? No, Ed? No. Gosh, I'm having a massive vibe. Like, we can. I can picture him vividly as
I can picture him too.
Yeah. Gosh, that's embarrassing. I should know that because we've even been on the set of Inside the NBA. But I don't understand how it works. Like, I don't understand how that combination is basically driving premium top ratings for a show with just such a weird mix of characters that I can barely understand what Shaq's saying half the time in terms of how he mumbles along, and Charles Barkley doesn't really make a lot of sense what he's saying. But this mix seems to work, and for those people that like work out the strategy of who they get to be those pundits and alike and make all that come together so effectively, full credit to them. I just don't get it. So I don't get it, but it works. It's a bit like sports sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I'll clarify. It's Ernie Johnson. We made that
Ernie
mistake.
Johnson. I was like, Eric. It's definitely not Eric. I knew it was something like that. It's pretty embarrassing.
Well, I'm just going to blame the time zones. Never get to watch it live, and we're just going to quickly move on to the next bit, Nick. But so, Nick, just to set this up for the people, over the next 2 weeks, we're going to do 2 pods. As I mentioned at the top of the show, you've done a bit of traveling this week. All domestically within Sweden, but it's been a very informative week for you. And there's just too much stuff to go around to try to squeeze it into one pod. So instead, we're going to try to spread it around, looking at some separate buckets, because you got a lot of interesting insights. And some of these events were maybe not as big as some of the big super events. And we've talked about some of those events actually then open up the door for some more learnings because they are a bit smaller and more intimate. And there are some big names in there that are doing some innovative, interesting stuff. So over the next 2 pods, we're going to break it down a little bit and dive into some of your experiences and some of the things that you got to learn over the course of that. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to kind of highlight that with before we jump into there.
Yeah, and also within this week's pod, we're also dropping an interview that I did at Sports Pro Live, which we'll introduce a little bit later on, which is a bit of insight into a really interesting data company that is making a lot of waves with how they're producing a lot of the data and getting broadcasters involved with that. But before we jump into that, I think that's a pretty good scene set. I obviously have been to a lot of events in my time, and I wear a bunch of different hats. I'm wearing the hat of someone who runs these types of things. I'm also wearing the hat of someone who's really in the thick of producing content around these topics and trying to learn and get a better grips of what's really going on in the market. And I'm always someone who's a big advocate for events. I don't love networking randomly with random people. I put my hand up for that, but which is, sometimes people find it weird to say given we run events, but it's the reality of it. But as long as you have a nice sprinkling of people that you do know, make a few new connections and then get some learnings from it, whether it be for the stuff on stage or off of it, it can be so immensely valuable to spend a day at an event or more. And I found it hugely valuable over those 2 days. I had a lot of great experiences, which we can dig into in a second. That really gave me a lot to digest, a lot to think about. It helped me get a better picture of where some of the industry is going that I think is really worth our listeners hearing a little bit more about, and hopefully helping people get a bit more of a sense of where we're going with a lot of different aspects of the sports media landscape.
Well, one of those businesses that is very well connected, and I imagine if you're working in the sports industry, you've heard of them, is Two Circles. And it sounds like they hosted an event themselves, had some clients around, and you were asked to be the host of the event. So you got a front row seat to everything and got to guide it a little bit. And, Two Circles, for me, at least, I knew them initially as a data company, sort of helping you with marketing and objectives along those lines, but they've just continued to expand as a business, touching all different places within the sports media landscape. Still data informed. Is that still their expression by how they go with things? But, Nick, maybe just talking a little bit sort of what you experienced leading that session at Two Circles and kind of where they're headed as a business, because obviously they're continuing to grow and expand their influence over the industry.
Yeah, everyone who works in the industry for a lot of years would be really aware and familiar with Two Circles now. But they keep going from strength to strength. They keep growing at a rapid rate. They've acquired a bunch of companies in the last few years. Really, they're a really powerful. I don't even know how to describe them. I was at an event, and I mean this in the nicest way, because they do so much now. They are commercial partners for some major organizations. They act as consultants and advisors in some situations. They do the sales and marketing in a lot of instances for major sports properties. They do basically everything you could think of. And I'll give some examples as we jump into it. But one thing they did at this event, which was really cool, and this event was built both a mix of the global trends to follow and also the local market, and local market being the Nordics. So all the major Scandinavian countries you could think of were in attendance. A lot of great rights holders and broadcasters in the room for that. So it was good to get that mix of learning a little bit more about some of the stuff they publish themselves around fandom, around market trends, and a little bit more going deeper into also some of the challenges that sports properties have in a market like that, where there is a bit of a ceiling that exists if you're serving a sport to a localized market. Can you grow internationally? Is there real room to scale your audience and take it that way, or is it just having to double down on who you're already serving? And then there's a lot of conversation around the balance, or I was pushing on it anyway, the balance between focusing on getting more value out of your existing audience and growing just new audiences generally. And they paint a really positive picture on where sports interest and consumption's going, which I found really fascinating to get people very excited about the fact that sports has a lot of opportunity still available to it.
So behind the scenes, you've alluded to some of this data. They would be talking about different things. Kind of having a look at their agenda here that you sent over to me. They're talking about changing media rights. They're talking about the future fandom. So there is a bit of degree. I think those two things are overlapped, where depending on how fandom's going is going to determine sort of what the value of those media rights are. So I'm assuming they're positive about the future fandom to feed into the value of future media rights, I would assume.
Yeah, so Gareth Bouch, who's the chief executive. Actually, I'll give you a quick question before I jump into it. How big do you think Two Circles is now?
Number of employees.
Number of employees.
Let's go with 800 globally.
Over 1,000 globally now. So they are one of the biggest. They are legitimately one of the biggest players in the industry. Offices in Switzerland, US, across Europe and the UK. They are, and Australia. They have got their presence over all markets. And Gareth Bouch did a great presentation on where they're at as a business, the relationship joining up with Spring Media, which is basically one of the acquisitions they did last year. And they presented a bit about just how they're coming together as businesses. So Spring Media had a lot of aspects that are quite complementary to some of the things that Two Circles do, but also a really good base of European and Swedish-based clients that they're able to basically open up the toolkit and say, well, Spring did this for you. Now we can do all these other things for you from a service perspective. But yeah, they were very positive. Gareth painted a really powerful picture of just where sports is going from a macro perspective in terms of interest. One of the interesting numbers was that, and you talked about fans. You talked about the fact that there were fans was a consistent thread. It was brought up consistently there. You need to keep focusing basically on building audience, building fandom, build that, and basically the commercial opportunities will come as a result of that. And it's probably taking a step away from what we tried to see a lot of sports do, is they more focused on maximizing the commercial value of its existing audience set. And they weren't saying not to do that, but they were very much saying, keep growing your audience, keep focusing on growth and expansion of that foothold, that fandom you have at both a core and a casual fan, and there'll be more opportunities to get out of it. One of the stats they published in a few reports and they presented, which is just to give you a sense of the scale, is that their stat that they use is that 46% of the global population will be sports fans by 2033. That is up from, well, basically that's 3.2 billion up to 4 billion. So that's a pretty massive jump. 20% will become sports fans in the next 10 years. And those people will consume 35% more sports than before. So the notion is basically that sports consumption is going up and up and up. And I think that was a nice reminder for some of us a little bit concerned about the fact that, sports are finding it difficult to cut through. You're seeing challenges around media rights. But actually, if we stop thinking about sports through the lens of live sports and just thinking about consumption of content around sports, then actually the numbers of consumption are going through the roof. So that was just a good reminder, I thought, about that basically if you think about it through a different lens and get away from the traditional model of just looking at media rights sales and consumption of the live sports in isolation, you get a much rosier picture of the health of where you can build audiences. And the final bit was that I think was quite interesting was just the growth of the market. They said that there's been 7% of revenue growth from sports IP owners. So it's not a huge number, but it's significant when it's in a mature market. And they're expecting, so that's up to 170 billion for the year 2024 of total revenue in the ecosystem with sports IP owners. And that's going to go up to 260 billion in the next 10 years in 2033. So that's a big jump. So it was basically setting the scene of there's going to be more revenue being generated. There's going to be more interest. You need to keep growing your audience set and more opportunities will be made and happen to be able to drive more value out of that audience over time, which I thought was just a good reminder for us all.
Did you get a sense, because we've spoken in the past, I know we've talked about, European media rights kind of seeming to stagnate a little bit. We've seen them grow in the US, but I think it's more the proportion of, we talk about the pie, more and more of that pie as you go into the Premier League, the NFL, the top of the top. With that number growing, did you get a sense that is still kind of cream rises to the top, or is that it's growing for everybody? Or did that really not get touched on?
Yeah, no, it did. It's actually a great question, Chris. You should do this more often. do this for a job. No, basically, one of the lines that was a good, and he had a really good definition on how they measured this. So, for example, they didn't double count revenue. That was a real big objective. So what that means is revenue going into the NFL, they wouldn't have media rights revenue being counted for the Dallas Cowboys as revenue, and if the NFL was just the NFL. But the number that they shared was about that 50% of the revenue is going to sit with a top 30 IP owners, and they measured something like a couple of thousand. So it's a big chunk of the revenue just going to a very small bucket. But what they did point out is that there are nearly 200, what they call them as super accelerators, basically sports properties that are growing faster than the market itself. So there is plenty of growth happening in lots of areas that is not just at the top of the food chain. And the main driver of that was audience growth, that they grew their audiences nearly twice as fast as everyone else was in the market. So I thought that was just an interesting reminder at a macro level to say, hey, there is some serious growth available. It still raised for me some questions about how to get there, and can those 200 or 182, I think was the number exactly, can they push themselves up in that top echelon, or is there still just going to always be the divide? That wasn't clear. But there was definitely a lot of examples that they gave that really gave you a sense that there is lots of growth to be had out there, but you have to innovate. You can't just sit still, which is not surprising, but I think now it's almost like if you sit still, you will go backwards. So you have to move fast, which, look, that's in Two Circles' best interest to say that as well, but I think you have to look at what's going on in the market, and that has to be the approach, right?
And in terms of growth, is that simply because we know the population of Earth is getting bigger, and therefore we expect people to grow up, and as they grow up, they're more likely to become sports fans? Or is this because there's something specific happening in the market, whether that is the democratization of content via YouTube and social media, or is it just simply the population's growing, therefore fandom will grow?
Great question. That's enough. Two solid questions in a row, Chris. You're absolutely you're making me think hard here. No, I think they didn't cover that question in that specificity, but my take on it is that the population of the Earth is growing, but not at the proportion that they're suggesting. And I think one of the drivers of that, or the levers of that, is that what the notion of, I remember hearing actually Rob Pilgrim, we've mentioned him, I think, on quite a few pods of late, but when we talked about, he did the YouTube presentation, what they classify as sports content is so much more broader than what we typically talk about as sports content when we're talking about live sporting events and highlights, right? It's all of those things around the edges that are using sports as a tool for content. And that's all growing at a pretty crazy rate, both because of all the sports properties doing way more of it, but also all the broadcasters and platforms and documentary series and all that storytelling going around it is happening, which is driving the consumption of more interest. So fandom's growing as a result of this new layer of content that's being created, and that's what's driving wider spread interest than perhaps we've had before.
And then maybe my last question on this, Nick, because you did mention it's a global event, but it's also focused on the Nordics. Was there anything from the local side, from a Nordics perspective, that you thought might be interesting as it's unique to the marketplace, that maybe it's not impacting the rest of the globe, or the globe is impacting the Nordics specifically? Were there any sort of interesting tidbits there?
Well, there was a presentation that Ludwig Gordebeck and Jakob Leander did, which are Jakob's a really great contact I've had in the industry over the years, who's really clued up with what's going on. They talked about macro trends and then brought it down more locally around the media marketplace. And then the follow-up I did was a session with a couple of the clubs. I did one with Malmö FF, which is the football, basically the football club in Malmö, which is one of the most prestigious clubs in Sweden. It has a huge successful pedigree. And Border Glimt, which is the club that was playing Tottenham in the Europa competition, that has a town of like 40,000 people, which was a really fun story to hear about. But just quickly on the market, I think the main three trends they talked about, particularly from a media landscape, which is definitely worth talking about, is the fact that digitalization is massively changing the way fandom is assessed, that the rights market's slowing down, and that dreaded word piracy is getting even worse. It's not getting any better. And obviously they did a bit of history talking about consumption trends. They showed a bit of demographic data on different audience sets and how it's being consumed by different demographics are consuming sports in different ways. So whether some are consuming via streaming, linear, and social, and you won't be too surprised about where those numbers pushed up. There's obviously the conversation around the death of linear as a medium, and that was something they presented a nice representation of, I think, using the Nordics as the marker for that. But what people may not be aware, who's not in the Nordics, is that Sweden in particular was one of the driving forces of streaming adoption, and have been leading that way for some time, whether it be SVT or other players who have launched streaming services. So the adoption is really high in that market. So overall, the net consumption of, say, TV through those different means has gone up and up and up. So for context, in Sweden, in about 2005, 2006, it was about 150 minutes per day of TV. And that was purely linear. And then as linear started dropping, linear is now down to, well, they're predicting in 2030 it'll be down to 50 minutes, but then streaming is going to be up to 150 minutes, netting that the total consumption of TV will be around 200 minutes of consumption per day per household. So just chew on that for a second. Basically, that means that in 25 years, we're expecting to see a 35% increase roughly of consumption of TV in Sweden alone, just through different means, which is streaming. Which just gives you a bit of a sense that that market is still absolutely there. It's just a question of what they are watching. They also talked about media rights, revenues flatlining and dipping, and they gave some great visuals of that. And the other thing they showed, which I thought was interesting, is just where the growth's coming from. So basically, they did a bit of a breakdown on using Deloitte's Money League and a few other bits, where basically where is the revenue growth coming for sports properties, and that growth is coming from game day, and it's coming from sponsorship sales. There's significant good growth happening in those sectors. It isn't from the media rights side. And that's why taking a different approach to media rights is so important. There was one final stat that really stood out for me that I think everyone should really pay attention to, is that nearly half of all fandom is made by the time you are 14 years old. So, yeah, and it doesn't really surprise. And then from there, it flatlines, and then it starts to dip. But you think about that, then you think about the responsibility and the way content's created now, and then the importance of grassroots in driving fandom. It gives you some pretty profound questions, right, about how sports needs to approach things if they want to make sure that the sport and the teams and the clubs have fans and are sustainable for the long term.
It's an interesting point. I think we often just credit what geographical region do we grow, who are parents a fan of, and I'm sure that definitely feeds into that. But like, I start to think of like, been a Bengals fan before I was 14, been a Cincinnati Reds fan before I was 14. Really, the only thing that I've picked up as new fandom is English football, but I had a pretty a dramatic change in life going from living in the US to the UK, where like it just became a significant part of my life. But I've also said, I'm not a golf fan. I'm not a tennis fan. These are all things like I didn't pick up as a kid. So like one person out of the 8 billion on earth, but it is interesting to hear. We talk about fandom in youth age, but it's interesting to hear it put in that particular way with the statistic.
Completely. And actually, I reflect on some of the stuff I see from my kids, and you can see that how excited they get about sports before they've even watched any. If you can just get those things working together in the right way, consuming the right sort of content, no wonder it can supercharge fandom and interest in a sport, right? Like my son was obsessed with Messi for a while, and he's never watched Messi play once in his life.
Yeah,
it's just because he's just friends of them are talking about it. He's heard the name mentioned a few times, and fandom can just be so supercharged at that young age. So that was just an interesting number. And I'll jump into the fan stuff a little bit further in just a second, not to go too much more on it, but I think there's some sound bites there that are interesting. The final bit, I'll go back to the piracy one for just a second. They shared a stat, which I think the source was Ampere Analysis, actually, and they report that there's 25 billion euros. So let me start that again. There's 25 billion euros lost annually for sports broadcasting through piracy, and around 51% of fans use illegal services every month. And the other stat they use, I think the number was about 40% of homes in Sweden use some sort of either password sharing or IPTV. Like that's a pretty significant number. And there's another big stat that, again, I think it's an Ampere stat that they shared on screen, was that 55% of all of those watching Marseille versus PSG in October last year was via illegal streams. So the majority of people watching that live sporting event, which had broadcast coverage, etc., was through an illegal stream. So we're pretty screwed, basically, without a change in approach, is what the massive conclusion of all that was.
Well, don't get me started on piracy, Nick, because we'll be here for the next 2 days. Very interesting stat is what I will leave that at, and probably support some of my beliefs on piracy and stop blaming the fans. But I will leave that at that, Nick.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, and I think I'll wrap it on this because I think I could talk more about it. There was so much interesting stuff that the Two Circles team, they were across so many data points, and their big message is like, know your fan, like really, really know your audience, know everything about them, and they're the best of the business at it, clearly. There was this really good presentation on fandom that Chris Grosch delivered, and Bettina Beer, and I could talk about that for ages. There was just one. I'm trying to think if I can find this stat now that they shared that sort of blew me away. Well, they try to break things up into core groups, core fans, and casual fans. There was 3 things they brought up, which was basically that drives fandom, lifelong fandom. It was knowledge. It was the fact that friction is the enemy. So basically, creating friction stops people being fans. Friction being subscription paywalls and the like, but also a lot of other examples they gave. And advocacy is exponential. What they mean by that is basically more people singing praises about a sport drives fandom at an exponential rate. There's a whole host of stats, and most of the stats and stuff that I'm talking about are in the reports that they have produced and have distributed. SportsPro has a bunch of them on their website. You can also find them on Two Circles website as well. But they have a really great picture of just what things like, for example, gaming does. Gaming helps drive almost twice as much knowledge of a sport if they're gamers of that sport than they are if they're not, which makes kind of a load of sense. But because that knowledge therefore drives the fandom, it becomes even more valuable as a result of that. And gaming isn't just playing EA Sports on a console. It could be doing quizzes and fantasy sports and alike, which can drive all those types of things. But the other final bit was really about friction, and I thought that was a really, really interesting topic. Basically, that there's different types of friction they talked about. One is personal or like life friction, and the other one is external friction. So life friction could be basically you're getting older, you've got to grow up, you've got work to do, those types of things. The other thing could be the external friction could be paywall platforms, those types of things. So basically they presented this pretty cool graph of basically in life how they basically cross over where friction in life, external friction becomes way more powerful, way more of a blocker as you get older, and life friction becomes less. So basically you have more control as you get older, but there's more things being thrown at you. And I just found it interesting that kind of intersected right around where midlife crisis happens, which is around late 40s or so forth. So I'm not sure there's something reflective in that, but basically that there's all these other factors that we don't often think about, and they call it friction, that basically can stop people from being fans of the sports. And I said it at the time on stage that it was kind of like a look into my soul a little bit because of how I used to be such a big fan of some sports, and I just don't have the time, the bandwidth to follow them in the same way anymore. And that was basically reflected in this graph. I'm like, gosh, okay, maybe now at least it all makes sense now.
Well, that reminds me of a conversation I had with Scott Gutterman, who's the SVP digital operations at the PGA Tour. Super smart guy, basically leads all the stuff they're doing from a broadcast front. And I remember him talking about tech investment. He was like, older people have more money but less time. Younger people have less money but more time. So when it comes to the decisions we make and the technology we invest in, if it's about monetizing young people, I'm not interested. If it's about driving fan engagement for older people, I'm not interested. Like, I understand how those people, which resources they are rich in and which ones they aren't in. And that helps me determine which technologies we decide to invest in. If they don't align with those two things, it doesn't make sense for us.
Yeah, and that's Scott's a really switched on guy. I think you have to listen to those people a little bit more because they're a little bit ahead of where most people are with regards to understanding that you can't look at things as simply as you want, whether it be doing X drives more revenue and so forth. That's not enough. You have to think a bit bigger picture. And so I think the Two Circles event really helped me reflect on that. I could go further, but I think I've talked probably about it enough length to give people a sense of I took a lot away from it in those on that day for sure.
So that's data from a strategic perspective, understanding fans' media rights. But one of the things we're going to pivot over to now is data and how it impacts sort of fan engagement in real time from a broadcast perspective. And as you mentioned, you had the opportunity to speak with, I believe it's the CEO founder at Sportable. And I think one of the interesting things about Sportable for me, and we've talked about, being able to serve fans and particularly super serve a certain type of fan. And I know for me personally, one of the things I'm really interested in is getting more data from a performance perspective, partly because I'm a big fantasy football guy, partly because my knowledge of the sport is a certain level that I want access to those things. I want to know how fast a DK Metcalf run over the span of 90 yards to prevent a pick six. Like, those are the interesting data points to me. Or when I'm doing my dynasty football leagues and, I want to figure out what somebody's top speed is because that's going to impact how good they're going to be in the NFL, things like that. More and more of that I feel needs to become available. And Sportable is one of the companies that is helping to deliver some of those sorts of insights to fans like myself.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, that was one of the points that they made at the event was that knowledge is power thing, or knowledge is really a driver of fandom. And to your point, the more access you have to the insight about what's happening on the field, the more likely you are to engage with and be more interested and feel like you're more closer to the action than you are just sitting back and watching and not really taking in any other information. And Sportable definitely doing some really cool stuff. The way they've been able to basically and you'll hear more about them in the conversation I had with Dugald Macdonald at Sports Pro Live. Actually, I did the initial conversation. Was they're using all this technology in the balls themselves to drive tracking, which gives you a whole different experience to. Typically we've been tracking people for all this time, but to get such a deep insight into the power and the revolutions and all these things that can happen. Some of I've seen this in bits and pieces before, but they take it to a whole nother level. It's really exciting. And the best thing is they're rolling this out. They've really got a strong base in rugby, but they're really expanding that profile across a whole host of other sports that they've been successful in doing a bunch of deals and pilots and partnerships with that, that I think is quite excited to see where it goes to.
And I think the other interesting thing as well, and I'm just going to keep name dropping everybody where we're in this episode, Nick, was I remember having a conversation with Andreas Hayden, who's going to pop up in our next episode in your Sweden streaming tech event, where he talks about, we're not really interested in investing in tech that is sports specific. And I think one of the interesting things about Sportable is initially, I think it was a performance-based tech, but now it's also something that has a broader media impact. And I think that's sort of the thing for businesses from a startup perspective that, you have to think about how your product can impact things beyond just such one simple vertical. And they've been successful in some investment rounds to expand in the company. And I'm sure that is largely due to the potential impact it could have from a media perspective, which I think some people you need to consider how your products can impact things beyond just being so specifically streamlined.
Yeah, you'll hear a lot of people that tell you need a 5-year plan. You need to be really critically focused on what you're doing, who you're serving, and so forth. But also sometimes you've got to adapt. And if you see there's a new opportunity or a different direction to take because you've unlocked something or found something, that unintended consequence kind of thing, okay, actually, this does a whole different thing we never thought about. You have to adjust. And I think that's what these guys and a whole bunch of the successful sports tech companies in sports that we follow have done. That they've pivoted at least once in their journey, or at least evolved their approach over time, because it's almost inevitable that you don't have all the answers when you first start on these journeys.
Yeah. So, Nick, we will go ahead and we will hand things over to your interview with Dugald, and we will catch you on the next episode of StreamTime Sports.
Thanks, everyone.
So I'm here with Dugald Macdonald, who is the CEO and founder of Sportable. Now, you've just come off stage. We're here at Sports Pro Live, a 2-day event happening in the heart of London. And this event's been running for, I don't even know how long it's been running for. Probably 13 years or so, I think, by now. But you've just come off stage doing a session and presenting a little bit about the business and the organization and what you're doing. But before we jump into what you've been covering on there specifically, talk a little bit more about Sportable. What do you guys do?
Brilliant, Nick. Well, thank you very much for having us today. It's been a lot of fun so far. So Sportable is a data collection, analytics, and commercialization business. So we serve the team sports market with mission-critical insights around skill and tactical performance of their favorite players and their favorite coaches.
So that's it. That ticks all the boxes for me when I hear it about athletes. It's about data. It's about monetization. All the musical words everyone wants to hear in the industry. Take us a bit further. What does that mean? What are you guys doing specifically that's providing that value and that insight on the data side, especially?
Sure. Well, I think it's not that we are doing something new. I think everyone in this industry and anyone really understands intuitively the value of data in sport, right? It's just such a competitive market. So performance insights around the best players and the best teams always going to have incredible value. The difference that Sportable brings is that it's the method that we do to tackling that problem, right? So what we do is actually we get our hands dirty. We collect data through sensor technology. We've built that all ourselves, and we embed that sensor technology in balls. So your favorite ball, whether it's a footy ball in Aussie rules, whether it's a rugby ball, football, American football, we're able to integrate a sensor that's measuring the location, the spin, the speed of the data in real time. And that data is then, packaged by our analytics engine into unique insights for fans, for players, you name it. Anyone who wants to get closer to the action is an eventual user of the data.
Now, the notion of having a chip put into a ball is almost a pipe dream from the years I've been in the industry. We've talked about the concept of this happening, and you're actually doing it. So talk us through what some of the sports that you're working with and able to deliver this sort of technology to, and what is the output you're delivering?
Yeah, well, we've been on a great journey with it because, as you can imagine, putting a sensor in a ball is challenging for many reasons. I mean, one, it's a inflatable rubber object that gets kicked by the most powerful human beings on Earth, and also the most sensitive human beings on Earth when it comes to the integrity of the product they're using, right? They can discern micro changes in their environment and particularly around their equipment. So you've really got to be able to get this right. So our journey started in rugby. We partnered with Gilbert, one of the preeminent sports brands in the world, let alone in rugby, where they are synonymous with the tradition of the game. And we went through this journey of understanding how players behave, how we could model the ball and make sure that the integrity stayed right. And through that, we created this really scalable solution where we can now put a sensor that measures spin, orientation, rotation, location 300 times a second into any ball anywhere at scale. And that's been a really key part of the value unlockers that we partner with major brands like Nike, for example, without disrupting their manufacturing processes. We create this new digital element to their product. And so they're really excited to get it into our shared customers' hands. And so we have these wonderful collaborations that allow us to move quickly.
Is it as straightforward as talking to Nike and say, hey, we want to do this, let's do some pilots and go for it? Because then you've also got the rights holder, the governing body side that comes into the play. I'm sure it comes in the conversation at some stage. What's that dynamic like? So,
yeah, great question. I think there's two ways, right? So one, you have the market-led approach, right, which is the latter part of your question, which is you have rights holders, whether it's a team or a league, who are always super progressive and they want to harness data, whether it's for fan engagement, whether it's to commercialize data, in secondary markets, or to improve performance, right, and get a higher ROI on their players and on their teams. So in that case, the market will insist to the ball partner and they'll say, look, guys, we really want this. And then we'll all work together to bring that technology to bear. So that's model number one. Model number two is kind of the partner-led approach, which is where you have a progressive ball brand, like Gilbert's a great example, where they see the future, they see the disruptive capability that technology can bring. And so we develop and then collaborate to bring it to the shared network of teams and leagues.
So for you, when you're going out and talking to these types of organizations, how do you make the business operate? What's the business approach? Are you doing a deal with Gilbert in this instance? Are you doing it with Nike? Are you doing it with the governing bodies? Is there some sort of, what's the type of approach you have to take? Because I can imagine it can be tricky.
It is tricky. It's basically everyone at the end of the day. I mean, I think that's part of the challenge of scaling the business is to find the sweet spot of, the core customer groups and, the core partner groups. But we have a nice mix now where, we look at the market through the lens of the ball partner first. Our go-to-market is built around those guys in the shared network. And then we look at the low-hanging fruit within that shared network, whether it's, are we solving a pain point for driving new revenue into a rugby league, or are we supporting high performance needs in a elite football team, right? And that's then how we triangulate and bring the tech into play. But really, sorry, I was going to add in there, but really anyone who needs high fidelity, high speed data is a potential buyer or a partner, which does make it a very wide range.
I can imagine. Now, let's talk about the data. How real time is it? How quick are you able to give that data to broadcasters, sports properties and teams for performance? I'm guessing it's servicing both performance and broadcasting, right?
Yeah, I think that's, a lot of the early things that we worked on were always about latency. So that's speed. Your partners or your off-takers, whether it's a broadcaster, whether it's a team, super sensitive to latency. So, we are anywhere between 200 milliseconds and 500 milliseconds, depending on the links in the chain downstream from us. So that's very fast. And then in terms of kind of the integrity of the data as well, you've got to make sure it doesn't get interrupted. And so another key piece of our secret sauce is how do you deliver, it's easy to deliver data, low latency, in a training ground, in the middle of the countryside. It's a totally different thing to do that in a 110,000 seater stadium with every type of electronic mobile phone connection interference issue you could face. And so having that defensibility in our technology has kind of reinforced our ability to get the data out and out in a safe way.
So you were on stage earlier talking about some of the ways that it comes to life in the data. Yeah. Talk about some of those other specific examples. Perhaps broadcasters are using it, or that performance leaders are using it.
Sure, I think the stuff that everyone really gets excited about, because you can really see and feel it, is that broadcast integration. So, our technology not only collects the data and analyzes the data, but we also have visualization as part of the technology stack. So, data in its purest form is unusable. You need to make it, consumable for your end audience. And so what we do is we have this visualization platform that then turns the movement of a ball into this transfixing arc of flames that follow it through the air, or an instant pop-up when a magical moment, whether of skill or whether it's of decision making, happens. We're able to bring an audience's attention to that immediately and then allow them to work their way around that, right? That's the nature of this technology, is it's customizable. People can curate their own experience as they see fit.
So you want to give the tools and the technology, put that in the hands of the broadcasters and the media players mainly, and let them get to work and maximize the value out of it mainly? Or are you looking at even a more of a direct approach with fans?
No. It's very much the former, right? We see ourselves as an empowering technology within the ecosystem. We're not the expert in understanding the fan. Those experts are the rights holder, it's the broadcaster. We want to make sure that those fans and the relationship with the fans stay in their pipeline. So if we can deepen that connection, if we can give them more information about the habit of that fan or what interest that fan might have on certain pieces of skill or certain pieces of tactics, then we've done our job.
So I love the sound of the technology. I love what it's trying to do for providing value to customers, consumers, and alike. Where's the growth come for Sportable now? Where are you looking to really grow? Is it working with broadcasters and selling more of that data, access to different platforms, or is it finding more sports partners to work with to get that ecosystem going, and then you're able to maximize the value of it afterwards?
So we always, well, at least I try to keep it simple. Is how, if I can collect data, how am I going to get it into places where that same piece of data can be used many, many times? And so there's two sides to that scale, right? Yep. The scale opportunity is in the fan environment. So focusing on how we get that data into broadcasts, gaming, fantasy sports, so that our partners, this channel partners of broadcasters, or the fantasy groups, are then using that and flooding it into the fans' hands, right? That's number one. That's pillar number one. Pillar number two is in performance and the engagement of data in the youth environment, right? And so that's a volume play, right? Every young player being able to pick up an app and understand their performance relative to their peers, relative to their heroes. That's another big element for us. And so we're kind of pushing into both of those environments because we see them as completely complementary and linked to each other. Mm-hmm. The relationship between that young player and as a fan and as a player is they're synonymous.
So you've been on this journey for a while. The company's not new to the market. It's been growing and evolving over the years. You've recently raised several million in investment to try and grow and take the next step. So where's the business at now? Where do you think you want to be in 5 years' time in terms of scale of the business and organization? So
fundamentally, we over the last 2 years proved, product market fit in the category of, fan serving data and performance serving data. And so now really it's about scaling out those products to the biggest addressable markets possibly. Our big focus is in football and American football. And it's well served by great market share in rugby and Aussie rules, where we're now focusing on penetration and market share. So that's really where the bulk of our investment goes, is into that sales and customer experience part of the business. But we are always innovating at an engineering level. Everything we have developed is patented, and we also recently acquired this visualization business that allows us to bring the data to life in a more exciting way. So this is the stage is set.
Definitely is set, and I'm sure lots of more opportunities to grow the business in different markets with lots of different sports. By the sounds of it, really sounds like you're only scratching the surface of the opportunity right now.
I mean, definitely. I think focus is a word that comes up a lot. When talking to our new shareholders and our investors, and that's just part of the challenges. There's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of scope. Whether it's to go further down the value chain, whether it's to go into new sports. The constant return on investment question is always there. I think where we are now is, we've got great early stage partners in some of these sports, and we want to be a mainstay here. We want to be essential. So it's we're focusing on going deep.
Well, one thing's clear that in the sports industry, fans definitely want more of content, more data, more insights. It sounds like you guys are sitting in a pretty sweet spot for that opportunity. But that is all we've got time for. Big thank you to Dugald to telling us a little bit more about the Sportable business. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick.
Now, before you go, if you liked what you heard today, be sure to rate and review and just let me know what you think on social. You can find me on most social platforms as SportsPro Nick. And please do spread the word of the podcast. There's no better way of marketing than word of mouth, whether that be in person or on social media. And if you don't like what you've heard, or you think we should be doing more or less of something, then reach out and let me know, as I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, Streamtimers. Until next time.